9 three-baby Mustang horses were left to die near a veteran's ranch. Then he discovered a shocking truth in the scorching heat of West Texas, where even the wind carries the dry breath of death. 3 baby Mustang horses were left trapped in the middle of the wilderness. No one heard their faint, broken cries. No one came, until a man, a war veteran who had lost himself somewhere on the battlefield, happened to pass by. And in that moment, he made a choice that would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful journeys like this one. The late summer heat in West Texas was a brutal kind of thing. It could sear the air, crack the ground, and steal the breath from your lungs, leaving you bone dry and weary in a matter of minutes. Even the wind out here in the desert carried the taste of dust and something harsher, like it was scouring the land of hope, as though it wanted every living thing to surrender and bow under the sun. You could drive for miles on end and see nothing but red dirt, brittle shrubs, and the occasional rocky outcrop, all shimmering in the haze. In a corner of this baked landscape stood the Morgan Ranch, a forlorn tract of land that had once seen better days. From a distance, it looked like a mirage, sagging fence posts, a roof with patches of rusty tin curling at the edges, a few gnarled mesquite trees offering scraps of shade to no one. The place might have been all right decades ago, when someone cared enough to tend the soil and mend the fence, but time had marched on. Now weeds thrust up through broken stones near the porch, and the barn looked tired, leaning slightly like an old man who had lost his cane. If you stood there long enough, you could almost hear the echoes of what it had been. Voices, the stomp of hooves, the creak of harness and tack. Now it felt almost abandoned, except for one single occupant who'd returned home after many years, uncertain whether this place was still home at all. His name was Colt Morgan, and he'd spent the last 7 years in uniform, far from the dusty roads of El Paso. He'd left as a fresh-faced kid, full of grit and a desire to prove himself. But he came back with more questions than answers. The lines on his face weren't purely from age. They were from experiences. Nights under hostile fire, losing friends he should have protected, living in a tension that never truly let go. When he'd first stepped off the bus back in Texas, people told him he looked older than his 20-some years. He didn't disagree. He'd inherited the ranch from his father, though he wasn't sure whether to call the property a burden or a legacy. The old man had passed while Colt was overseas, leaving behind a few dozen acres of mostly arid land, a dilapidated barn, and a set of memories Colt had never fully resolved. Since returning, Colt hadn't decided whether to sell the place or try to resurrect it. The idea of rebuilding felt both noble and draining. Either way, that morning he couldn't stand being cooped up inside the house. The silence pressed too heavily on him, reminding him of things he didn't want to recall. So he hopped into his battered pickup, an ancient truck with flaking paint and a dull metallic sheen that might once have been a proud copper color. He rumbled along the dirt tracks that led behind the ranch, scanning the fence line for anything amiss. Breaks in the wire, corners that needed fortifying, signs of animals that roamed in from the desert. The radio was off, no music to distract him. He was used to quiet these days, but sometimes even quiet was too loud, like a roar in his head. The sky above was cloudless, the sun halfway to its zenith, and every now and then a swirl of red dust blew across the road, momentarily blinding him until it passed. He kept the windows rolled down, letting the furnace-like wind graze his face. As he neared the edge of his property, something, call it a fleeting echo, drifted into his awareness. At first, Colt thought it was the truck's old engine, or maybe a trick of the desert wind. But then he heard it again, a faint, rasping sound that ended abruptly, like someone choking on words, or an animal choking on breath. He killed the engine, letting the truck idle down to silence, and listened. At first, all he heard was the throbbing hush of open land. Then it came again, a thin, halting whinny, the cry of a horse in pain. Colt felt his gut tighten. He'd spent enough time in rough places to recognize genuine distress when he heard it. He slid out of the cab, scanning the area with narrowed eye. The air smelled of hot earth, and each step he took sent up little puffs of dust around his boots. Ahead lay a stretch of neglected fence, some portions collapsed or leaning. Beyond that, dried grasses and mesquite shrubs offered occasional patches of brownish green. With each footstep, he listened, trying to gauge direction by the slight shift in sound. Finally, He spotted something unusual in the distance, a patch of disturbed soil, as though something had dug up the ground or set a trap. The closer he got, the more clearly he saw how the land was torn up, clumps of dirt scattered around a shallow depression. And then he saw them, three small shapes, motionless, except for the labored rise and fall of their flank. They were foals, Mustang foals, to be exact, and they had been caught in what looked like a specialized snare. He spotted a rough loop of rope crossing the dusty earth, a battered cinder block or stake hammered in to hold the lines. Colt's heart twisted. He approached like someone approaching live explosives, slowly, carefully, mind racing. The largest of the three, a little grayish foal, with a coat the color of ashes, still stood on trembling legs. A coarse rope looped around its foreleg. Blood had crusted where the rope had cut into its hide. Its eyes were wide and bright with a kind of furious defiance, as though it refused to fall. Next to it lay a smaller chestnut foal, rope biting into its belly and back leg. That one was trying to whinny, but each attempt ended in a panting gasp. The third lay almost entirely immobile, a pale, cream-coated youngster with both hind legs pinned by the trap. Flies buzzed around the raw wounds. Its breath came in shallow, desperate bursts. Colt knelt, speaking softly, "Hey there, easy," as though speaking to a wounded soldier who might thrash at any moment. "I'm not the one who did this to you." He pulled a multi-tool knife from his belt, flicked it open, and started with the smallest foal, the one that looked on the verge of giving up. With infinite patience, he sliced through the ropes, one at a time, checking to be sure he didn't cut flesh. Each little snap of the rope strings was answered by a flinch from the foal, but it seemed too exhausted to fight. When at last the last coil fell away, Colt slipped a hand under the animal's neck, feeling the frantic flutter of its heartbeat. He exhaled, an odd ache in his chest. The chestnut foal, seeing the movement, tried to scramble away, only to squeal in pain as the rope around its middle tugged tighter. Colt turned his attention there, murmuring quiet assurances. "It's all right, I promise. You just gotta stay still." A few more careful cuts, and the rope slackened. The foal collapsed onto its side, panting. He half expected the biggest one, the gray foal, to lash out, but it merely stared, ears flat. Colt recognized defiance that was dangerously close to terror. He reached out, managed to saw through the final loop. The rope fell aside, leaving behind a raw, bloody line that circled the leg. Colt reached for his canteen, tipping a small trickle of water into the palm of his hand. First, he offered it to the chestnut, which slurped greedily, then to the smallest foal. Finally, he extended his dripping hand toward the gray. For a moment, the little horse just glared, as if refusing charity, but at length it lowered its head, sniffed, and lapped the water with guarded thirst. Once free, the three foals didn't bolt. They were too weak. Colt surveyed the area and spotted a red-topped stake hammered near the edge of the disturbed ground. There were some letters stenciled on it, part of which read, Batch Wuro 99I, and Wege. He guessed it referred to a breeding or capture program, no matter the specifics. The fact was plain. These Mustangs weren't just random strays. Someone had caught them, someone who planned to come back and collect their living spoils. Colt tried calling an animal rescue line. No answer. He tried again, still no one. Not surprising, he thought sourly. Out here, resources were scarce, and often no one came unless you had the money or connections. He sank onto his knees, looking at the foals in turn. If he left them here, they'd die. If he tried to call for help again, who knew how many hours, days, he'd wait before someone showed. He exhaled. Even though he had no idea how to care for three traumatized Mustang foals, he also knew he couldn't just walk away. The next half hour was a blur of physical labor. He headed back to his pickup, rummaged for a tarp and some planks, cursing the sun that seared the back of his neck. He rigged up a makeshift ramp into the bed of the truck, layering the tarp with whatever bits of leftover hay and cloth he could find. Then came the real ordeal, coaxing and lifting each foal inside. The chestnut resisted at first, thrashing until it nearly collapsed in Colt's arms. The smallest one could barely stand, so he scooped it up gently like a child, feeling its heartbeat fluttering against his chest. The gray foal followed last. It limped painfully, but it walked up the ramp with a stoic dignity, never once turning its gaze from Colt. By the time he got them settled in, he was drenched in sweat, chest heaving. He made sure they were as comfortable as possible, gave them more sips of water. then climbed into the driver's seat. As the truck bounced over the uneven desert ground, Colt glanced in the rearview mirror. He could see the gray's head, ears pricked forward as if studying him, measuring him. The eyes that stared back were neither grateful nor fearful, merely resolute. Colt felt a jolt in his chest. He'd expected fear, desperation. Instead, it was more like a challenge. Prove you're worthy of our trust. He drove slowly, mindful of every bump, until he reached the boundaries of Morgan Ranch. In the shimmering heat, the place looked no less run down, but at least there was some sense of familiarity. The house was small, a single story with battered siding. Beside it stood the barn, or a structure that once deserved that name. The paint had peeled off in wide sheets, revealing warped boards. The windows were dull, layered with grime, yet, for better or worse, it was the only shelter around for mud. Colt pulled up near the barn, turned off the engine, and lingered for a moment, letting the adrenaline subside. He realized his hands were trembling from the exertion and the swirl of unspoken emotion. But in that moment, he also felt something else, a spark of determination, reminiscent of his days in the service, when he had a clear purpose, a mission. He hopped out and made his way to the back of the pickup. One by one, he guided the foals down, using the same improvised ramp. The chestnut nearly collapsed as soon as its hooves touched the ground, so Colt braced it against his shoulder. The smallest one took a few shaky steps and promptly sank onto its knees in the dust. The gray stood off to the side, head low. Colt couldn't tell if it was about to bolt, or if it was simply too exhausted to do anything at all. The barn wasn't in prime condition, but it still had a roof and a few intact stalls. Once upon a time, his father had kept riding horses here. Though Colt barely remembered them, he was too young when they sold most of the livestock. Now, though, the place smelled of old manure, moldy hay, and something stale. Dust motes whirled in the slanted sunlight as Colt shoved the big doors open. He walked inside and coughed. The floor was covered in a thick layer of grime, and cobwebs draped the rafters like ghostly curtains. Still, it would have to do. He kicked aside debris, found some half-rotten bales of straw he promptly decided to discard, then grabbed a broom and started sweeping like he was on a mission. The dust rose in clouds that caught the sunlight, swirling around him. Eventually, he cleared out a corner stall. The boards looked stable enough that a desperate foal wouldn't immediately kick them down. He fetched a few buckets of water from the old pump. Miraculously, the water still ran. Maybe there was some life in this place yet. Next, Colt went back to the truck and coaxed the foals inside. One at a time, the chestnuts stumbled across the threshold, spooked by the echoes, and circled the stall in a panic. Colt spoke calmly, a habit from dealing with anxious soldiers in the field. "Easy, easy. You're all right now." The smallest one walked so gingerly, eyes half closed. Colt practically carried it, letting it rest against his hip. The gray made no fuss, stepping into the barn with methodical slowness, ears flicking at every new sound. He secured them with loose ropes to the stall posts, not to restrain them harshly, but to prevent them from hurting themselves if they panicked. Then he slumped down against the wall, sweat trickling down his neck. The day's heat pressed in from all sides, and inside the barn the temperature was only slightly less oppressive. Colt removed his cap, wiped his forehead, and he had 3 half-dead Mustang foals in front of him, and no plan beyond the next hour. He swallowed. This was bigger than anything he'd handled alone, and a wave of self-doubt washed over him. But there was no turning back. Once he caught his breath, he grabbed the broom again, tidied the area around them, and offered water in a wide pan, setting it within reach. The chestnut, still trembling, lunged for the water. The smallest one drank in feeble licks, eyes distant. The gray refused to move until Colt stood back a few paces. Only then did it lower its head, nostrils flaring as it sipped. The tension in its posture told Colt it was ready to fight or flee at the slightest provocation. He recognized that stance from countless nights on patrol. The sky was turning orange when Colt realized he needed proper supplies, feed, medication if possible, or at least something to cleanse wounds. So he hopped in his truck again and drove to town. The local feed store was a squat building on the outskirts, run by an older couple named Miller. They'd known Colt's father, though they hadn't been close. Colt tried to explain he had 3 rescue foals, needed hay, possibly milk replacer, electrolytes. Mr. Miller raised a curious eyebrow, but took Colt's money and helped load the supplies. No one asked questions. That was the Texan way sometimes. You did what you had to do, and the reasons were your own. Back at the barn, he set up piles of fresh hay. Working by flashlight, he cleaned each foal's wounds carefully with warm water and a rag. The chestnut snapped at him once, a half-hearted gesture that ended in a pained whimper. Colt murmured quiet words, as if soothing a frightened friend. The smallest foal barely reacted, blinking dully whenever Colt wiped the sores around its hind leg. Then came the gray, which pinned its ears, shifting away from the rag. Yet it let Colt close enough to dab at the rope burns. He felt a flicker of admiration for its raw spirit. Night settled, bringing a slight drop in temperature. Colt found an old camping cot in a corner of the barn, along with a musty sleeping bag. He set them near the stall door, well within earshot of the foals. He also brought in a shotgun from the house, propping it against the stall's outside rail. He wasn't afraid of the foal. He was afraid of whomever had set that trap. A gut feeling told him that people who do such a thing might come looking. He lay awake in the barn, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the young horses. Occasionally the chestnut would shift and snort, or the pale one would give a soft wheeze. The gray mostly stood vigilant, as though it refused the luxury of lying down. At some point, Colt dozed off. When dawn arrived, it found him in the same place, stiff from sleeping at an odd angle. He rose slowly, rubbed his gritty eyes, then checked each foal. The chestnut was already nibbling at the hay, the smallest dozing with its legs curled beneath it. And the gray was staring right at him. The moment Colt moved, the gray tossed its head, as if to say, "Don't think I'm letting my guard down." The morning hours passed in a blur of chores. He'd never cared for more than one horse at a time, let alone 3 half-wild, half-injured foals. But he discovered that methodical labor steadied him, boiling water to sterilize cloth, mixing feed, cleaning stalls. Each small progress helped. Around midday, the smallest foal took a few steps around the stall. Approaching Colt, he was sitting on a wooden crate, flipping through old papers, some ranch receipts, some scribbles from his father. The little one nudged his knee with a trembling muzzle. Colt froze, not wanting to spook it, then slowly lifted a hand. The foal lowered its head until its whiskers brushed his knuckles. A hesitant trust. The chestnut, now stronger, was trotting small circles around the stall, whinnying in short bursts. Several times it got too close to the gray, which responded with pinned ears and a swift flick of the tail. Tension lingered. Still in that silent standoff, Colt saw a certain synergy. They were different in color, size, and temperament, but they were united by the experience they'd survived. By late afternoon, Colt felt the first flicker of relief. No one had shown up to claim them. He told himself maybe they wouldn't. Maybe the criminals who set that trap had bigger fish to catch. Or maybe they'd figure the foals had died. Nonetheless, Colt refused to drop his guard. He planned to sleep in the barn again that night, just in case. Before sundown, he made a run into the house to rummage for anything that might help. He found a few dusty veterinary pamphlets, some half-empty bottles of antiseptics from years ago, plus a stack of old ranching magazines his father had saved. He wasn't sure how relevant they were to half-wild musking foals, but it was better than nothing. His second night in the barn was quiet. The chestnut slept more soundly, lying down. The smallest seemed stable enough to rest without panting. The gray still maintained its aloof posture, though its wounded leg trembled less. Colt wondered if it had known real human kindness before this, or if it had only known fear. He drifted off with those questions swirling in his mind. The next few days brought a fragile routine. In the morning, Colt would check the foals, change bandages if needed, clean out the bedding. He'd talk to them, absent-mindedly, like someone might talk to themselves in an empty house. "How are those legs doing, buddy? You hungry, big guy? Yeah, I bet that stings a little. Sorry about that." He found that speaking to them also settled his own nerves. It reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. The foals, in turn, started to adapt to his presence. The chestnut now trotted up to him when it saw him enter, occasionally mouthing at his shirt or hair. The smallest waited for him to sit down, then carefully approach, no longer stumbling. The gray kept its distance, closer than day one, but not by much. It was around this time that Colt realized he needed to give them names. He'd read somewhere that once you name an animal, it carves out a space in your heart that's hard to close. But the truth was, they already had that space. One late afternoon, the temperature finally dipping below scorching, Colt decided to clean them up properly. He hauled buckets of lukewarm water, found some mild soap, and began gently sponging away the layers of dirt and dried sweat. The chestnut squealed in mild outrage at first, then settled. The small one let out a curious grunt, blinking as the dust turned the water a murky brown. The gray was last, wiggling but not attacking. Somewhere in the midst of that impromptu washing session, Colt started talking aloud. "Look at you," he murmured to the gray. Colt like ashes, eyes black as coal. "I'll call you Ash, that all right with you?" The gray flicked an ear, refusing to confirm or deny. Colt moved over to the chestnut. "You're trouble, I can see that, always bouncing around. Buck, that's your name. You hear me?" The chestnut jerked its head up in mid-splash, as though it liked the sound. Finally, he turned to the pale one, the frailest of the group. "And you, gentle soul, you smell like, I don't know, that desert herb, sage. That's it, sage." The little one nudged Colt's shoulder, as though in cautious agreement. Afterward, Colt felt an unexpected lump in his throat. He realized the significance of naming them. They weren't just random victims of cruelty, or a burden on his meager resources. They were living, breathing companions who had found their way to him, or maybe he'd found his way to them. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, Colt allowed himself a faint smile as he drifted off to sleep on the barn cot. Bit by bit, Ash, Buck, and Sage integrated into the ranch's routine. Or rather, Colt built a routine around them. He found and repaired an old paddock adjacent to the barn, hammered in new boards where the fence had rotted, and cleared out tumbleweed. By the third morning after naming them, he felt confident enough to try leading them outside, giving them a little exercise in the open air. Buck trotted out boldly, muzzle high, sniffing at every foreign object with the bounding energy of a healthy young horse. Sage trailed behind, flinching at new sounds but inching closer to Colt whenever anxiety spiked. Ash waited, as if measuring the surroundings, then walked out in a slow, deliberate manner. It was then that Colt truly heard something that filled him with unexpected warmth. The sound of hooves and the soft whickers of horses, exploring a space without fear. The ranch had been so silent, so hollow. Now it resonated with these small, vibrant noises. He found himself sweeping the yard with a renewed purpose. He stacked bales of straw, made sure the water trough was clean. All the while he spoke softly if one of them came near, especially Sage, whose trembling grew less frequent by the day. During one quiet evening, when the sun melted into the desert horizon and bathed everything in a warm, golden glow, Colt stood leaning on the paddock fence. He watched the three Mustangs. Buck was busy investigating a corner, sniffing at a small bush. Sage dozed near a half-repaired section of fence, nose tucked under its tail. Ash roamed the perimeter, as though on guard duty. Something in Colt's heart unfurled. He couldn't recall feeling so protective of anything in a long time, maybe not since he was first deployed, responsible for the safety of men who were nearly his own age, or younger. He remembered how that sense of duty once felt, heavy, but also galvanizing. He realized he was feeling it again, but now for these creatures who spoke no words, yet had their own stories and pain. "I see. We had a report of 3 Mustangs from a certain batch. Very valuable bloodlines, meant for specialized breeding. They went astray. The organization I represent is called Weki. Perhaps you've heard of it." Colt thought of the fleeting glimpses he'd caught in that suspicious stake at the trap site. Weki. Norzo 990. The letters had haunted him more than once these past nights. "Can't say I'm familiar," he lied, keeping his expression neutral. "All I know is that these foals were left to die in some kind of rigged-up trap. I wasn't about to leave them." Griggs exhaled sharply through his nose, though his polite facade didn't crack. "Well, that's unfortunate. Still, I'm afraid we have every right to reclaim them. They do belong to our operation, and by extension, they're legally ours." "Legally," Colt repeated, a spike of heat rising in his chest. "Last I checked, setting a lethal snare for horses, especially Mustangs, wasn't legal." "You got a court order for that, Mr. Griggs?" The older man's gaze hardened. "Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Paperwork can be arranged. The fact remains, these are Wegi property. Our records show them as lost from a designated breeding program. I was sent here to retrieve them. If they're on your land, you're in possession of animals that belong to someone else." Colt crossed his arms over his chest, heart pounding. He remembered how Buck had trembled under his hand, how Sage could barely stand, how Ash's leg was rope burned. The idea of handing them back to the kind of people who'd do that was unthinkable. "I won't let you take them," Colt said flatly. "At least not without a court order. If you've got the law on your side, show me. Otherwise, get off my land." Griggs lifted his eyebrows as though mildly impressed. "Suit yourself, Mr. Morgan, but I'd hate for you to run into legal problems down the road. Those foals aren't some random strays. They're a specialized breed with a certain investment behind them. Our interest is in returning them to their rightful place." Something about the man's tone sent a shiver up Colt's spine. He realized Griggs was neither pleading nor threatening, simply stating what he considered fact. Without another word, the stranger tipped his cap. "I'll be in touch," he said, stepping back to the truck. "You take care now." The black pickup rumbled away, leaving a churn of dust in its wake. Colt stayed at the gate, fists clenched, watching until the swirl dissipated. Then he let out the breath he'd been holding. It occurred to him that the Mustangs might be in even greater danger now. Whoever this waggy was, they had enough resources to find him within days. That alone spoke volumes. Eventually, he headed back toward the barn. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground, painting it in copper hues. As he neared the structure, he saw Ash in the paddock, ears angled toward the road. The horse seemed keenly aware that something had just happened. Buck stood by the fence post, sniffing at the boards, while Sage lingered in the shade. When Colt reached Ash, the foal gave a soft snort, as if to ask for confirmation that everything was all right. Colt stroked the Mustang's neck. "I'm not sure everything is all right," he murmured, "but I'm not letting them take you." He felt a surge of adrenaline and protectiveness flare inside him, so intense it made his chest tight. Part of him wanted to track Griggs down and demand more answers. Instead, he settled on a quiet resolution. He would do whatever it took to keep these foals safe. That night, he lingered in the barn longer than usual, going through grooming motions almost mechanically. Buck kept nosing his pockets, hoping for treats. Sage dozed peacefully, no sign of the old tremor. Ash stood a few feet away, occasionally glancing toward the barn door, as if anticipating another intrusion. The silence pressed on Colt's nerves. Something told him that Griggs's visit was just the start of the trouble. The sense of dread lingered. By the time Colt tried to sleep, he spent hours pacing the small living area inside the ranch house, glancing out the window at intervals to make sure no strange headlights glowed in the distance. His mind churned over the cryptic mention of Weggy. He remembered that red stake in the desert trap reading. He also recalled the half-recalled times as a child when his father received packages or visitors from out of town. Hush-hush dealings that Colt never fully understood. The next day, the feeling gnawed at him so relentlessly that after finishing his chores, he went rummaging through the old workshop and the battered desk his father had kept. The desk itself was locked, but Colt eventually found a ring of keys in a tin box of nails. He tried them one by one, and after a few frustrating moments, a small brass key turned with a click. The top drawer slid open. A musty smell of old papers and dust wafted out. Colt carefully lifted the scattered documents, scraps of bills, ranch ledger notes, and a few letters bearing unfamiliar letterheads. Most of them looked unimportant, some official forms for feed purchases, a canceled check or two, but near the bottom of the stack lay a metal box with another lock. This time it took him a while to locate the right key. When he did, the box's hinges squeaked open, revealing a bundle of files bound by rubber bands. He brought the box into the house, cleared the kitchen table, and flipped on a dim overhead light. Something about it made his pulse race, like he was about to unearth a dark secret. When he carefully pulled off the rubber band, the top folder had a faded label, W.E.G. Inside lay a sheaf of typed pages, many covered in scribbled notes, genealogies of horse bloodlines, as well as references to advanced breeding technique. He found words like genetic markers, project viability, competitive stock, and a repeated mention of Bloodstorm, apparently some prized sire known for speed and endurance. The longer Colt read, the clearer the picture became. W.E. stood for Western Equine Genetics Initiative, a privately funded project that specialized in breeding Mustangs with certain prized traits. They boasted success in creating high-performance show horses, cavalry mounts, and crossbreeds for overseas market. Yet the tone of the notes was cold, clinical, describing defective litters and elimination processes. Colt felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. They treated living animals as though they were commodities, nothing more than raw genetic material. He flipped through the pages until he came across a letter, typed but signed by someone with an unreadable signature, referencing bachelor's. One line leapt out at him. Should the current litter show any disqualifying traits, proceed with standard disposal protocols by end of week. Disposal protocols. Colt swallowed hard. This was no routine. This was euthanasia or worse. Searching further, he found an old black and white photo of a tall, powerful stallion with Bloodstorm scrawled in the margin. Next to it was a scribbled note in his father's handwriting. Impossible to maintain. Wuggy demands perfection. Additional hazard if public finds out. He realized with a jolt of horror that Ash, Buck, and Sage must be from that same imperfect litter, offspring of a champion lineage that Wuggy had chosen to discard because they somehow didn't match the organization's standards. And apparently his father had known something about it. Did the old man invest in or collaborate with them? Colt had no memory of direct involvement, but these documents suggested a link. Night had fallen fully by the time Colt finished poring over the files. He felt a chill despite the lingering desert heat, rubbing his temple. He tried to piece it all together. His father must have kept these dealings hidden, possibly accepting shipments or serving as a middleman. Maybe the older Morgan had regrets, or maybe not. Regardless, it was clear that the litter labeled Batch E099A had been marked for termination, left to die in a trap as though they were defective goods. Colt rose from the table, pushing the papers aside. A deep anger roiled in his gut. He thought of how the foals had trembled under his care, how close they'd been to death, and all for what? Some breeding enterprise's twisted pursuit of genetic purity. The idea of calling them worthless was repugnant. They matter, he muttered, glancing out the window toward the barn. I'm not letting them get tossed aside like garbage. Despite the late hour, he couldn't sleep. Restlessness prowled in his body, as if echoing the Mustang's primal instincts. Instead, he paced the living room, rereading certain notes by lamplight, aware that every fresh detail only sharpened his resolve. Wiggy wasn't just a casual outfit. They had the resources to send people like Mason Griggs. They'd label these Mustangs as property, or evidence, or anything else that would let them reclaim them. Then they'd do precisely what they'd intended all along: erase them. The thought made Colt's stomach twist. Toward midnight, he stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand, scanning the area. The sky stretched wide and clear, a spray of stars over. The incident left him rattled, yet resolute. If people were truly willing to sneak onto his land under cover of darkness to reclaim these Mustangs, he needed a better plan than simply standing guard. By first light, he'd already gathered every relevant scrap of paper he'd discovered. The old documents bearing the initials BA, the cryptic references to Batch 0099A, and the shocking memo about elimination protocols. He added photographs he'd taken of the foal's injuries, shots of the trap and snare lines, plus pictures of the footprints he'd found near the barn. Then he slipped in images of Ash, Buck, and Sage as they were now, half-healed but vibrant, visual proof of what had nearly been lost. He packed everything into a worn leather portfolio that had belonged to his father, stuffed a manila envelope with copies as backup, and snapped it shut. The barn door was still barred shut from the inside. Colt entered carefully, checking that no one had tampered with the padlock overnight. Buck greeted him with a quick nicker, pressing a soft muzzle against Colt's arm. Sage stood a bit behind, swishing her tail anxiously. Ash, always watchful, gave a low snort and flicked an ear at Colt's approach, as if to ask, "What now?" "I'll be gone a little while," Colt murmured, running a hand across Ash's neck. "But I'm doing this for all of you." "All right." He gently rubbed Buck's forehead and let Sage sniff his palm, then topped off their water. He felt that same surge of protectiveness he'd carried ever since the first night he brought them here. Only now, it was laced with a sense of duty. He double-checked their feed, made certain the stall latches were secure, and slipped out the door, locking it behind him. The battered pickup rattled to life. Colt steered it down the uneven dirt path, leaving behind the silhouettes of the barn and paddock in a swirl of dust. The early sun cast elongated shadows over the plain, the golden light revealing the dryness of the landscape. He tried not to dwell on the possibility that someone might come sniffing around while he was gone. Instead, he focused on the only immediate course of action he hadn't yet taken: going to the law. Sheriff Amos Keene's office lay near the center of the small town, a cluster of old brick and clapboard buildings huddled around a wide main street. Colt found a parking spot outside an aging storefront with peeling paint that read, County Sheriff. The glass door bore star-shaped decals, half faded by years of relentless sun. He grabbed his leather portfolio from the passenger seat, took a steadying breath and stepped in. At a quick glance, the front office held the typical trappings: a few chairs along a wall, a wooden counter scuffed by countless elbows, and a vintage bulletin board with tattered wanted posters and missing pet flyers. An aging air conditioner hummed in the background. Tucked behind the counter was a deputy with salt and pepper hair, who eyed Colt with mild suspicion until Colt introduced himself and requested to speak with Sheriff Keene. The deputy nodded and vanished into a back room. Moments later, the sheriff appeared, a solidly built man in his late 50s, a slight paunch around the belly, thinning hair combed back. He held a chipped mug of coffee in one hand, wearing an expression that mixed curiosity with faint recognition. "Morgan," he said, setting the coffee down. "I didn't expect to see you here so soon." His deep voice carried a note of familiarity. Colt dipped his head in greeting. "Sheriff Keene," he replied. "It's been a while." The older man gestured for Colt to follow him through a battered door into a small office lined with filing cabinets. An ancient air conditioning unit rattled in the window, providing a low drone. The walls were decorated with photos of deputies through various eras. In one, an even younger Keene stood beside a man Colt recognized as his father, both sporting mustaches and stiff, half-smiling posture. Keene sank into the squeaky chair behind his metal desk, motioning for Colt to take the other seat. "Well, I'd say you look different from the last time I saw you. You were, what, a teenager back then? I heard you joined the Army." "Marines," Colt corrected softly, setting the portfolio on the desk. "Been gone 7 years. I came back recently after my father died." Keene nodded, empathy flickering in his gaze. "Sorry about your loss. I knew your old man. He was a tough sort, didn't share much. So, what brings you in today?" Colt released a slow breath, flipped open the leather case and withdrew the sheaf of documents. "This," he said, spreading out the photocopies, notes and pictures. "I found 3 Mustang foals caught in a snare near my property. Turns out they belonged, to an organization called WEGI, Western Equine Genetics Initiative." "WEGI?" Keene muttered, eyebrows knitting together. "I recall hearing that name somewhere. Some state-funded research that went private. If I remember right, that's what these files suggest." Colt confirmed, tapping a page. "They breed Mustang stock for specialized uses, military, show circuits, maybe even overseas markets. But here's the kicker. If any foal is deemed unfit or unstable, they get rid of it, quietly. That's what they tried to do with the ones I rescued." Keene picked up a photograph of Ash's rope burns, his expression hardening. "You're telling me these folks intentionally left them in a trap to die, or to retrieve later for disposal?" Colt replied grimly. "I'm not entirely sure. Either way, someone from WEGI already showed up at my ranch, claiming the foals as property. And last night I caught another trespasser who nearly made off with them." The sheriff's jaw tightened, and he thumbed through the notes in silence for a moment, scanning references to Batch 099 and Bloodstorm. Every page seemed to paint a darker picture of corporate secrecy and monstrous disregard. He came across a set of lines underlined in red, handwritten comments from Colt's late father. One note read, "WEGI demands no mistakes. All defective litters must vanish." "This is bigger than just a couple of stolen horses," Keene finally said. "Looking up, if what you're showing me is accurate, we could be dealing with a major case of animal cruelty, potentially a felony under state and federal law, especially if Mustangs are involved. And if these animals were part of a previously government-funded program, there might be federal oversight in the wings." Colt let out the breath he'd been holding. "So you'll help me?" "Damn right I will." Keen shoved aside the photos and closed the folder. We'll need official statement. I'll talk to some folks in Austin. Agriculture Department contacts. Maybe. These programs typically have strict guidelines. If they're skirting the law, we'll find out. Also, that name you mentioned, Clayton Rowe, I recall we've had a couple of complaints about him operating shady breeding stables around the county lines. Nothing stuck before. Maybe we finally have reason to pay him a serious visit. Relief washed over Colt like a cool breeze. Until that moment, he'd felt like a man screaming into a void. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said, genuinely meaning it. "Those foals don't deserve to be dragged back into whatever hell Ouija's running." Keen gave a firm nod. "We'll make some call. Let me keep these duplicates so I have evidence on hand. You best keep the originals safe. Also, I'll arrange for a deputy to drive by your ranch more often, just to let them know we're watching. But be careful. Colt, if these people are as deep-pocketed as it sounds, they won't give up easily." Colt stood to go, casting one last glance at the photo on the wall. His father smiling beside a younger Keen. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said quietly. "That, I believe," the sheriff replied. "Now go on. Let me start stirring the pot." Colt drove back from town with a weight off his shoulders. Yet an undercurrent of tension continued to coil inside him. He'd officially put the wheels of the law in motion, which might be the best or the worst thing to have done. Regardless, it was done. He had no intention of letting Ouija or anyone else seize Buck, Sage, or Ash without a fight. Not after everything they'd already been through. Back at the ranch, the afternoon sky glimmered a blinding white, with the sun perched near its zenith. Colt parked behind the barn to keep the vehicle out of sight from the main road. The Mustangs were huddled under the barn's overhang, seeking shade. He spent a few minutes tending to them, then went about reinforcing some boards near the corral. A sense of urgency pressed him onward. Nails hammered a bit faster, motions more deliberate. He wanted everything secure. Fences, doors, vantage points before nightfall. Yet the attack didn't come that night, nor did it arrive the following day. What did arrive was a phone call from Keen late in the evening, reporting that local authorities were gathering evidence on the breeder, Clayton Rowe. They hoped to move quickly if they unearthed any direct wrongdoing. Colt felt a grim satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, the law would shut down Ouija's cruelty from the top down. 3 days passed. The tension in the air lingered, but nothing disturbed the ranch aside from the usual swirl of dust devil. Colt eased back into something resembling a normal routine. Yet he never dropped his guard. Mornings he let the foals out into the paddock. Carefully supervised, he continued to watch Ash with fascination. The gray horse displayed an uncanny awareness, as if scanning the horizon for threat. Buck, by contrast, hopped around the yard in playful leaps, investigating new scents. Sage began showing a sweet curiosity, quietly approaching Colt for comforting pat. He told himself that if Ouija's trying this, live with legal muscle, maybe with more clandestine intimidation. Little did he know that their next approach would be brazen, arriving in broad daylight like a thunderstorm on a cloudless day. It happened early one morning, just as the sun was cresting the horizon. Colt was busy in the paddock, placing fresh hay in a small trough. A sudden rumble of a heavy vehicle drifted from the direction of the main gate. He turned and spotted a massive black truck, towing a sleek horse trailer with tinted windows, rolling down his dirt road at a purposeful crawl. No roaring engine or flamboyant entrance, just a quiet, confident approach, like the predator that knows it already holds the advantage. Heart thudding, Colt rested the hay bale on the fence and wiped his hands on his jeans. Ash pricked up his ears. Buck froze mid-trot, and Sage let out a startled nicker. The truck came to a halt a short distance from the corral, close enough for Colt to see the driver's door open. A man stepped out, tall, wearing a black shirt and polished boots that didn't suit the dusty environment. Even from that distance, Colt could see a glint in the man's eyes, a cold, glassy look. He paced forward, meeting the stranger near the battered gate. The morning light cast elongated shadows behind them both. Up close, Colt saw that the man's hair was dark and slicked back, his posture exuding authority. He looked like someone used to giving orders. "Silas Black," the man announced, tapping a finger to his chin. "Representative of Weggy's main office." He didn't bother extending a hand. Colt tensed, arms folding across his torso. "So I take it you're not here to say good morning." Silas gave a thin smile. "I'm here about Weggy's property. Free Mustang foals from our batch. We have records that put them right here on your ranch. I'd prefer to collect them quietly, without any fuss. Is that so?" Colt said, voice low. "I found them in a death trap left on my land. Nobody wanted them until now, so I'm not sure you can call them your property." Silas shrugged, a gesture that seemed more predatory than nonchalant. "You're dealing with a recognized breeding program, Mr. Morgan. Their DNA is documented by every legal standard. They belong to us. I have a trailer and tranquilizers if necessary. I don't want trouble, but I won't leave without them." Before Colt could retort, two other men hopped out of the truck's passenger side, moving to the trailer. One pulled open a side compartment, revealing long poles and what looked like a collapsible chute system. Colt's hands clenched into fists. They were prepared to load and cart away Ash, Buck, and Sage like livestock. "All right, let's calm down for a second," Colt said, stepping in front of Silas, trying to block his view of the barn. "I've got local law enforcement aware of the situation. If you really have a legal claim, you should go through the courts." Silas gave a humorless laugh. "Courts? That could take months or years. We prefer to handle our own matters expeditiously. Look, I get that you're attached to them, but they're not wild horses. They're the product of a controlled gene line, slated for destruction if found unsuitable. It's not personal, just business." At that, Colt bristled. "You talk about living creatures like they're defective machinery. Let me guess, you found out they might have undesirable traits, so you decided to kill them quietly. That sure as hell is personal to me." Silas's smile vanished. "We have our reasons, Miss Morgan. Genetic consistency is paramount in our research. These foals can't be allowed to remain in the public eye, especially if they exhibit anomalies." "Anomalies?" Colt echoed, remembering how Ash had reacted that night. How Buck hopped around joyfully. How Sage timidly sought comfort. "That's what you call them?" One of Silas's men had already pulled out a tranquilizer gun, checking it meticulously. The other began unfolding a steel cage ramp from the back of the trailer. The morning sun glinted off the metal, painting an eerily clinical picture on Colt's dusty ranch. Anger flared through him. Suddenly, Ash stepped out from the barn door, head high, ears pivoting. In the corral, Buck stopped and stared. Sage, though visibly trembling, crept forward behind Ash. Before Silas or his men could advance, the Mustangs marched right up to the fence line, placing themselves squarely between Colt and the strangers. "Interesting," Silas commented, raising an eyebrow. "They're forming a bond with you faster than we anticipated. If we'd gotten them sooner, that wouldn't have happened." Buck snorted, letting out a loud, agitated whinny. Sage hovered close by, eyes wide yet somehow resolute. Ash, front and center, pawed the dirt, as if daring anyone to cross. Colt reached out, resting a hand on the gray Mustang's withers, and said in a quiet, shaking voice, "They're not a batch number, not property. They're living souls." One of Weggy's men climbed onto the fence, tranquilizer gun raised. Ash immediately bared his teeth, stomping the ground in a display that screamed, "Don't you dare." The man hesitated, then glanced at Silas, who lifted a hand to signal caution. "This is a problem," Silas muttered. "We can't force them without creating a scene. And if word gets out that Weggy forcibly seizes or kills Mustangs, we're going to face a PR nightmare." He narrowed his eyes at Colt. "You must realize we're not walking away from this permanently. You've stolen our investment, and we won't simply let that go. But for now, I'll step back." "That's wise," Colt said, voice grim. He glanced at Ash, who was still bristling with tension. Buck fidgeted, letting out quick huffs of air, while Sage tried to press against Ash for reassurance. Silas nodded to his men. Reluctantly, they folded the steel ramp back into the trailer, stowed the tranquilizer. "This isn't over, Morgan," Silas said, stepping toward the truck. "I promise you that, when the time's right, we'll return with the proper authority, and you'll have no choice but to hand them over." Colt's pulse thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to hold steady. "I guess I'll see you in court, or anywhere else you want to try." Silas didn't answer, only fixed Colt with a cold stare before climbing into the driver's seat. The engine snarled, tires kicking up a dusty cloud as the vehicle reversed out and rumbled off the property. The entire ordeal had lasted mere minutes, but it left Colt's heart pounding as though he'd sprinted a mile. By the time the truck disappeared behind the bend, Ash let out a long breath, ears relaxing slightly. Buck snorted again, glancing from Colt to the road, while Sage lingered close, trembling. Colt rested a shaky hand on Ash's neck, feeling the Mustang's taut muscles beneath the coat. "We did it," he whispered. "We stood our ground. But they'll be back." Behind them, the ranch seemed to exhale as well. The wind stirred a few loose scraps of hay, and the sun continued its climb as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet Colt knew better. A line had been drawn, a challenge hurled. Wiggy had all but declared war on his quiet piece of land. He had only his own determination, a tangle of evidence, and 3 young Mustangs who refused to be broken. That might not be enough. Or maybe, in ways he couldn't yet predict, it would be more than they anticipated. He turned to see Ash, Buck, and Sage still arrayed protectively around him. Buck nuzzled Colt's shirt, wanting comfort. Sage's eyes revealed both uncertainty and a flicker of trust. Ash regarded him with a steady gaze, a reminder of that shared vow: we protect each other. He could almost sense the Mustang's challenge to Wiggy. "Come back if you dare." "Thank you," Colt murmured, voice catching with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. The Mustangs had chosen him, stood by him, demanded that the invaders leave. In that moment, under the scorching Texas sky, Colt felt a surge of hope that outweighed his fear. They had become something like a family, unorthodox, precarious, yet undeniably real. The confrontation was over for now, leaving behind only the hush of mourning. But Colt suspected the next move would be more calculated, perhaps hidden behind legal forms or men with stronger resolve. Even so, as he scratched Ash's neck, letting Buck whicker into his ear, and Sage lean her head against his arm, he accepted the path he was on. He'd chosen to stand with these horses, and they had chosen him. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. After the tense confrontation with Silas Black and the silent departure of his black truck, Colt Morgan stood by the paddock for a long while, letting the adrenaline fade from his body. Ash, Buck, and Sage remained close, as though unwilling to leave Colt unguarded. In the warm hush of morning, he realized something crucial. If they spent the rest of their days cooped up in fear, waiting for the next threat, it wouldn't be a life worth protecting. Freedom meant more than merely surviving. It meant knowing you could stand tall without expecting an attack at every turn. That realization planted a fresh determination in Colt's mind. He remembered a lesson from his years of military service. Confidence often came from capability. Soldiers who felt prepared were calmer, less prone to panic under fire. Perhaps the same applied to these horses. If they learned to harness their instincts, if they grew confident in themselves, no outside force could break them easily. They wouldn't be cowards. Half-wild creatures, but strong individuals with the means to stand their ground. It was early afternoon when Colt strode into the barn, retrieving a coil of rope and a handful of wooden stakes. He also found some old plastic barrels, leftover paint cans, and sturdy boards stacked in a dusty corner. One by one, he dragged them outside to the open space behind the barn. The ground there was flat, sun-baked, and ringed by a few struggling mesquite shrubs. An ideal spot. He decided to set up a simple training arena. He hammered stakes into the hard earth, stringing rope between them to outline a makeshift corral. He cleared away stones and debris, then arranged the barrels and paint cans into an obstacle course. Nothing elaborate, just enough to let the horses practice weaving through or stepping over low barriers. His hands worked steadily, mind abuzz with plans. This was no conventional breaking process. He wanted them to discover their own potential. He wanted them to know that their bodies and instincts were reliable tools, not cursed traits. As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, Colt stood back and surveyed his handiwork, a crude but serviceable training ground. He wiped sweat from his brow, then headed inside to gather Ash, Buck, and Sage. If they were to face more trouble from Waggy, they deserved to do so with every advantage. Ash was the first to set foot in the improvised arena. Colt opened the gate and let the gray Mustang walk at its own pace. Ash paused a few yards in, ears swiveling, nostrils flared to catch any unfamiliar scent. Colt made a soft, low whistle, a signal he'd begun using whenever he wanted the horse's attention. Ash's ears pricked, and the horse turned, taking a few steps closer to Colt. "Let's see what you can do," Colt said, voice calm. He moved his hand in a subtle gesture, then tapped his thigh. Ash blinked, a silent question in its gaze, but took a step forward, crossing the first small plank Colt had laid on the ground. Another whistle, and Ash paused, looking back at him. In only a few days, the connection between them had grown. It wasn't about commands so much as conversation, body language, and carefully placed cues. Ash wasn't being forced. It was choosing to follow. A few minutes in, Colt led Ash toward a pair of barrels. He pointed, tapping them lightly. The horse snorted, suspicious, but circled the barrels slowly, hooves thudding in the dust. By the end of half an hour, Ash managed to navigate around the barrels, step neatly over a low wooden rail, and stop precisely where Colt indicated. Each success earned a soft murmur of praise, a gentle pat on the neck. With every little victory, Colt saw the flicker of pride in Ash's posture. It wasn't human vanity, but an equine sense of accomplishment. I did something right. The horse's swift learning reminded Colt of the night it had charged that intruder without hesitation. Ash had innate instincts, as though it had been bred or prepared for advanced tasks. But now, for the first time, it was using those instincts in a context of trust, not fear. Buck proved a different story altogether. When Colt brought him out to the makeshift course, the chestnut immediately became entranced by a butterfly flitting over a patch of scrub grass. Buck trotted in circles, whinnying playfully, until Colt managed to redirect his attention. The moment Colt set up a tiny hurdle, a board raised a few inches. Buck hopped it with enthusiasm, only to bound away toward a battered paint can near the fence, nose it curiously, then dash back in a wide arc. Each time Colt tried to lead Buck with subtle signals, the young horse responded with bounding energy that sometimes ended in comedic stumbles. Yet for all his distractibility, Buck lit up whenever Colt offered a mild word of approval or a quick pat on the neck. The chestnut whickered, as if to say that was fun. What next? Gradually, Colt realized Buck's biggest motivator was the joy of interaction. If Colt turned training into a playful game, Buck would eventually come around, bounding happily to attempt the tasks with gusto. The method might be unorthodox, but it worked. With enough patience, Buck hopped rails, zigzagged between the barrels, and even trotted behind Colt's left shoulder without a lead rope, provided Colt kept the mood light. Sage, though, posed the greatest challenge. The pale foal trembled at every unfamiliar noise, whether the clang of a shifting barrel or the distant rumble of a passing truck. Colt didn't force Sage to run or jump. Instead, he spent hours just sitting near the fence, letting Sage circle closer at her own pace. Sometimes he'd hum quietly or speak in a soft tone about ordinary ranch tasks. Eventually, curiosity coaxed Sage nearer, step by tentative step. By the fifth day, she dared to place a hoof over a low rail on her own, nose quivering. Colt resisted the urge to cheer too loudly. He simply offered an encouraging murmur. "You've got this, girl." That's it. Over time, Sage began associating the training area with gentle experiences rather than panic. She even sniffed the barrels, touching her muzzle to the paint-splashed sides, as though to confirm they weren't predators. Little by little, a tiny flame of confidence ignited. It might never burn as brightly as Buck's energetic spark or Ash's warrior spirit, but it was her spark, and that was all that mattered. Within a couple of weeks, Colt saw how the three Mustangs functioned like puzzle pieces, each completing the others in unexpected ways. When he tried guiding them together, no saddles, no halters, just gestures and whistles, something astonishing happened. Buck would trot ahead, forging the path with playful curiosity, while Ash would keep the line, maintaining a disciplined pace, and Sage followed at a measured rhythm, scanning the environment. Colt learned to shift his posture, wave an arm or blow a distinct whistle to change their direction or prompt them to stop. It was an unspoken language built on trust, repeated patterns, and the acceptance that none of them were perfect. At sunset, Colt often allowed them to roam free in the open portion of the ranch. He'd stand under the purpling sky, listening to their hooves drumming the earth. First chaotic, then gradually settling into a synchronized pattern. It wasn't the pounding of fear or flight, but the calm, steady beat of animals who felt safe enough to move at will. He wasn't teaching them submission. He was guiding them toward a state where they could be fully themselves, strong, intuitive, and free from paralyzing anxiety. If Weggy ever returned, these horses would not be broken creatures locked in survival mode. They would be a force, a family bonded in mutual protection. As Colt watched them in the golden haze of dusk, something in his own chest felt freer too. Perhaps he was discovering the kind of life he'd lost sight of, one of quiet confidence rather than relentless vigilance. Meanwhile, Sheriff Amos Keene had not been idle. He had the dossier Colt provided, which included the old Weggy notes, the reference to batch Aero 99AA, and photographic evidence of how the Mustangs had been trapped and injured. Through discreet channels, Keene contacted a federal wildlife officer he'd known for years, someone who specialized in illegal animal trade cases. This officer in turn flagged the possibility that Weggy's breeding projects might breach state and federal regulation. After a week of hush-hush coordination, Keene assembled a small task force, local deputies, a federal ranger, and a few state-level investigators from the Agriculture Department. Their target was Clayton Rowe, a name that had appeared repeatedly in the Weggy document. The group acted swiftly, launching a surprise inspection of Rowe's property. The results were damning. They found fraudulent breeding permits, falsified health records for dozens of horses, and a hidden storeroom containing sedation drugs not approved for standard veterinary use. Rowe, cornered, couldn't offer a plausible explanation. Under questioning, he allegedly let slip that Weggy wants these lines gone if they can't meet requirements. That single statement pointed investigators straight back to the organization's central operation. They seized boxes of files, computers, and shipping manifests. Rowe was promptly placed under arrest, pending more formal charges. Keene relayed the news to Colt by phone late one night. The sheriff's tone was cautiously optimistic. "We haven't shut down Weggy yet, not by a long shot," he said, "but we've definitely poked a bear." Rowe was their go-to breeder for Mustangs, and his records link back to Weggy's main base. Looks like they had a standard protocol for culling defective batches. Colt felt a surge of relief. The law might take its time, but at least the momentum was building. So what happens now? We keep digging. If the feds confirm that Weggy abused either government funds or engaged in cruelty beyond the scope of any legal breeding program, they could face serious charges. Meanwhile, keep your eyes open. They won't appreciate us shining a light on their work. Colt hung up, stepping outside to find Ash grazing quietly by the fence. He patted the Mustang's flank, feeling the warm coat against his palm. "They found your old breeder," he said softly, recalling how that same man had likely orchestrated the trap that almost killed them. Ash lifted its head, muzzle twitching. Colt smiled. "You're safe," he whispered, "and we're closer to giving you justice." It didn't take long for the media to pick up the story. A few local Texas outlets ran headlines like "Mustang Rescue Uncovers Illegal Breeding Operation" and "Rowe Arrested in Horse Call Scandal." Soon, larger statewide publications latched onto the notion that wild Mustangs, icons of the American West, were being systematically erased for failing genetic standards. Outraged readers. Public sentiment surged. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for Weggy's shutdown. Reporters reached out to Colt, eager to interview the man who first exposed the trap. He politely declined on-camera appearances. In his view, the story wasn't about him. Instead, he offered a handful of photographs to a local newspaper. A shot of Buck, Sage, and Ash standing together in the yard, the open sky behind them. The haunting clarity of their eyes said more than Colt ever could. One feature article titled "3 Lives, 1 Chance the Mustangs Weggy Threw Away" circulated widely, fueling a wave of public indignation. Colt found the attention overwhelming. He wasn't used to fielding phone calls from activists or reading internet comments that turned him into some kind of folk hero. He recognized the good in it, though the more outrage the case sparked, the harder it would be for Weggy to bury their misdeed. Of course, it also meant Weggy might double down on legal strategies or smear campaigns. One evening, Colt came across a brief news clip on TV, an anchor describing the scandal rocking the equine breeding world. He switched off the set halfway through, unsettled. The Mustangs in his barn were not a scandal, nor a sensational headline. They were living creatures that had nearly been destroyed by a callous system. He preferred to focus on them as individuals, not as pawns in some grand scandal. Late that same night, Colt sat outside near the paddock, resting his back against a fence post. The moon was high, silvering the yard. Ash ambled over, nuzzling Colt's shoulder. He smiled, ruffling the Mustang's mane. "We haven't won yet," he murmured, "but maybe we're on the right path." Sometimes the loudest noise doesn't come from shouting. but from not backing down. It was as if Ash understood, the near Colt's ear, exhaling softly. That moment of unspoken companionship calmed the swirl of Colt's worry. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that justice, true justice, might be possible. Not just the legal kind, but the moral truth that these three horses had value far beyond any breeding chart or genetic test. Over the following weeks, as the Weggy investigation broadened, life at Morgan Ranch found a gentle rhythm. The tension with Weggy lingered in the background, but Colt and the Mustangs concentrated on living fully. He continued refining the training sessions, letting Buck, Ash, and Sage roam in the big paddock each morning. Their trust grew deeper with every passing day. Then came a letter from a non-profit organization. The director explained how they'd heard about Buck's playful, energetic nature through the grapevine of rescue groups, and were hoping to adopt him for a therapeutic riding program. Colt felt torn at first. Buck had become such a fixture of daily life, always bounding up to him in the morning, nudging his pockets for treats. But he also realized Buck was the perfect candidate to share that boundless joy with kids who needed it most. He negotiated one condition. He would personally deliver Buck to the facility, and he wanted visiting privileges at least once a year. The organization agreed enthusiastically. On the day Buck was meant to leave, Colt loaded the chestnut into a borrowed trailer. Buck paced inside, letting out a series of loud whinnies as though uncertain about the trip. Arriving at the therapy ranch, Colt felt a mix of pride and sadness swirl in his chest. Staff members welcomed Buck warmly, guiding him to a comfortable enclosure near a stable of other therapy horses. A small group of children watched from behind a low fence, curiosity in their eyes. One boy, perhaps 10 years old, stood apart. He wore large headphones and seemed hesitant, his gaze flitting between Buck and the dusty ground. Gently, a staff member encouraged him forward. Buck, sensing the child's reticence, lowered his head, ears angled in soft greeting. The boy inched closer, then tentatively reached out a hand. Buck sniffed it, blowing warm air onto the boy's fingers. A tremulous smile spread across the child's face, his first genuine grin in 6 months, the staff later told Colt. Seeing that moment, Colt swallowed hard, tears stinging his eye. "You're in the right place," he whispered to Buck, patting the horse's flank. "Take care of them like you took care of me." When Buck turned a bright, inquisitive gaze on him, Colt knew the horse would be fine. Time continued its slow march. Colt had just gotten used to Buck's absence when another visitor arrived. This time an older woman in her 70s, quietly dignified. She introduced herself as Lillian, a widow whose late husband had been a cavalry rider decades ago. She'd seen the article about the Mustang scandal, along with a photo of a pale, timid horse that Colt had described as gentle, yet fearful. "I'd like to meet her," Lillian said softly. "I've lost a lot these last few years. Maybe we can help each other." Colt led her to the paddock, where Ash and Sage roamed. Lillian settled onto a weathered wooden stool, placing her cane aside. Sage, ever cautious, hovered a few yards away, uncertain. But Lillian stayed quiet, her gaze warm and open. Minutes passed. Slowly, almost timidly, Sage approached. The mare sniffed Lillian's sleeve, then pressed her muzzle against the woman's shoulder. Lillian's eyes glistened with tears. She lifted a hand to stroke Sage's cheek, voice trembling. "I thought my heart had turned to stone," she murmured. "But this sweet girl, she's making it beat again." Colt stood to the side, hearing every gentle word. He recalled the day he'd first rescued Sage from that snare, how she'd barely been able to stand. To see her now, forging a quiet bond with someone who needed that softness, felt like a promise fulfilled. They arranged the adoption soon after. Lillian's home was just 2 hours away, on a modest property, with a sturdy barn once used for her husband's horses. When the day came for Sage to leave, Colt walked her onto a small trailer. Sage glanced back at Ash, who nickered softly as if bidding farewell. Colt's throat tightened, but he knew this was right. Sage had chosen Lillian as much as Lillian had chosen her. He gave the older woman a nod as she drove off, comforted by the way Sage pressed gently against Lillian's arm, even during the journey. That left Ash, the gray Mustang who had once defended the barn with a ferocity that belied its youth. Colt didn't consider letting Ash go anywhere else. Something deeper bound them, a shared understanding that had emerged from nights of vigilance and days of growth. With Buck and Sage starting new lives, the ranch felt quieter. But Ash and Colt continued their morning routines, checking fences, practicing subtle cues in the training ring, exploring the edges of the property. When the legal storm around WAG finally reached a crescendo, resulting in fines, restructuring, and a forced public statement, condemning past errors, it felt anticlimactic. The real victory lay in the horses that had survived. 2 years slipped away in a parade of changing seasons. Colt found a new calling, traveling with Ash to schools, veteran centers, and shelters. They demonstrated how an animal once deemed disposable could thrive, how trust could mend the invisible wounds that haunted both humans and horses alike. Standing in a gymnasium or a stable yard, Colt would briefly recount the story of discovering the foals in a trap, leaving out the darker details, but emphasizing the resilience of these creatures. Then he'd invite Ash to demonstrate simple movement. No reins, no bridle, just a gentle whistle or shift of weight. Children with wide eyes approached cautiously at first, then broke into delighted smiles when Ash lowered its head for them to pet. Some grown men and women, veterans like Colt, would watch with tears in their eyes, recalling their own scars. Over time, Colt honed a quiet way of speaking, never too dramatic, never self-congratulatory. He let Ash's calm presence do most of the talking. One afternoon, they visited a small community center where local kids gathered. After the demonstration, a bright-eyed girl blurted, "Is Ash your horse?" The question hung in the air a moment. Colt paused, recalling how at the start of this journey, he might have given a simple yes or no. But now, truth was more layered. He placed a hand on Ash's neck. "I guess you could say we belong to each other," Colt answered, scratching behind the Mustang's ear. "Ash isn't just my horse. I'm also Ash's person. We look out for each other." The girl nodded, satisfied, as if this made perfect sense, and Colt felt the warmth of that clarity settle in his chest. He remembered all the heartbreak that had brought them here. The breeding program, the trap, the chase, all of it had led to this moment, where an animal once slated for destruction offered hope and friendship to strangers. Leaving the center, Colt looked down at Ash's silver-gray ears. "We've come a long way, haven't we, bud?" Ash blew a soft breath in reply, stepping in time with Colt's boots across the asphalt. The events that started it all, bloodlines, Weggy's manipulations. The near-fatal trap had faded like a bad dream. In their place stood a new reality. 3 Mustangs had found freedom, each forging a path that enriched human lives. Buck, bringing laughter and milestones to children in need. Sage, healing the loneliness of a mourning widow. And Ash, steadfast at Colt's side, traveling the state to share a silent lesson about endurance and second chances. To any casual observer, it might look like an ordinary man leading a gray Mustang on a lid rope through a parking lot. But Colt knew better. Ash walked with the quiet authority of a survivor. A horse who had once faced death and chosen life, not just for itself but for the man who'd rescued it. Colt had once been lost in his own way, adrift after war, uncertain what home meant. Now he found purpose in showing the world that even a so-called defective Mustang could become a beacon of strength. The day Colt returned to the ranch after that visit, he left the gate open to the wide back pasture. He had no fear Ash would run off. Sure enough, the horse grazed peacefully by the fence line, then trotted over when Colt approached, as if to say, "Where are we off to next?" Colt simply chuckled, leaning against the gate. The sun dipped low behind them, rays painting the sky in lavender and gold. He reflected on the old words from the Wugwe file. "Destroy if flawed." Those words had once sentenced these foals to oblivion. Now they served as a reminder of how flawed that system was. Because in the end, the Mustangs weren't the ones who needed correction or culling. The system that viewed living creatures as disposable was. A gentle breeze rustled the scrub brush. Ash tilted its head, ears flicking at the subtle shift in the air. Colt scratched under the Mustang's jaw, noticing how the horse closed its eyes in contentment. An image of pure trust. Quietly, Colt murmured, "We're still here," as though speaking to the wind, the ranch, and perhaps to every wound left in both their souls. "And we're not going anywhere." No reply came but the hush of evening and the soft fall of hooves, stepping closer. Yet in that silence lay an undeniable truth. Some journeys forged by hardship and courage lead to a bond so genuine it defies any label of ownership. They had not tamed each other. They had learned to walk side by side, each offering the other a reason to keep walking. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us. Marin leaned against the barn post, her silence louder than words. She had seen cruelty before, but this tested the edges of what she thought people were capable of. Officer Delano reviewed the report with furrowed brows. This wasn't just negligence. It was something darker, something that pulled at the seams of justice. Cole stood near the fence line, the wind whispering through the grass like a voice from another life. The foals watched him, not with fear but with a quiet question.